had been planning that camping trip for months. By the time summer rolled around in 2012, I needed to get away from work and from people. I lived in Ohio then, 26 years old, working a warehouse job that left my body sore and my head tired. I had grown up loving the woods, the smell of dirt and pine, the sound of water running through creeks, the quiet that only wide open spaces can give. I had saved up some money and decided to spend a long weekend out in a remote area of Pennsylvania where a buddy of mine once hunted deer. He told me the place was empty most of the year, and if I wanted solitude, that was the spot. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon in my old Ford Ranger, the back filled with camping gear, a cooler, a small tent, and some basic supplies. The drive took about 4 hours, most of it highway, but eventually I got off onto winding country roads that stretched through farmland and slowly turned into dense woods. The further I drove, the fewer houses I saw, until eventually there were none at all. By the time I reached the old logging road my buddy told me about, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. The road wasn't really a road anymore. It was rutted, muddy, overgrown, and in some parts barely wide enough for my truck. I crawled along, wincing at the sound of branches scratching the paint. Eventually, I came to a small clearing about 100 yards from a stream. It looked like the perfect spot. Flat ground, open enough for a tent, but surrounded by thick trees that made me feel tucked away from the rest of the world. I cut the engine and for a moment just sat there, listening. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars in the distance, no people, just the faint trickle of water from the stream and the occasional bird. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up near the tree line, the cooler tucked in the shade to keep things cold as long as possible. I gathered some sticks and started a small fire. By the time I had everything settled, the light was fading fast, and the woods around me took on that heavy, dark feeling that always makes the air seem different. I ate a sandwich by the fire, watched the flames crackle, then crawled into my tent with my flashlight and sleeping bag. The first night passed mostly fine, though I had trouble sleeping. Every noise sounded sharper out there. A snapping twig, a rustle in the leaves, the distant call of some animal I couldn't identify. I reminded myself it was just the woods being alive, nothing unusual. Still, I woke up a lot, heart racing, shining my flashlight around the thin fabric walls. Nothing, just the dark outside and the steady sound of the stream. The next day I spent exploring. I hiked upstream, following the water as it twisted through the trees, sometimes disappearing underground only to surface again further ahead. The woods were thick and I had to push through undergrowth in places, but I loved it. I felt alive in a way I never did back in the city. At one point, I found the remains of an old cabin, collapsed into the ground. Just a pile of rotted logs and rusted nails. But it made me pause. Someone had once lived out here, maybe decades ago. I stood there a while, imagining what kind of man would choose to make a home in a place like this. By evening, I was back at camp, sweaty and tired. I washed off in the stream, cold water shocking me awake. Then I made another fire, cooked some canned food over it, and sat in the fading light, staring at the flames. That was when I noticed something strange. Across the stream, maybe 50 yards into the trees, there was something pale leaning against a trunk. For a second, my stomach dropped. It looked like a person standing there, half hidden, watching. I froze, staring, not even blinking. After a few moments, I realized it was just a birch tree, the white bark glowing faint in the last light. My heart slowed back down, and I laughed at myself. But still, even knowing it was a tree, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I stayed closer to the fire that night, throwing extra logs on just to keep it bright. I must have fallen asleep outside because I woke up in the middle of the night, the fire mostly ashes, the woods pitch black around me. My flashlight was inside the tent, and for a second I debated getting up to fetch it. That was when I heard it, Footsteps, not animals scurrying, not a deer crashing through the brush. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving just beyond the glow of the dying fire. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped, then started again, circling. I couldn't see anything, just black woods. My mouth went dry, and I realized I had left my hunting knife inside the tent too. I sat there, perfectly still, every hair on my arms raised. The footsteps moved closer, then paused again. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I packed up my sleeping bag and sat there, waiting for the sun to rise high enough to push the shadows back. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or coyote. But deep down, I knew those weren't animal footsteps. I'd lived long enough to know what a person walking on leaves sounds like. Still, I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. All day, I tried to distract myself with hiking and fishing, but the thought kept creeping back. What if someone was out there, watching? By the time night fell again, my nerves were shot. I built the biggest fire I could, kept my knife strapped to my belt, and sat there clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. It was around midnight when I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, whistling. Faint, far off, but unmistakable. A slow, tuneless whistle drifting through the trees. My chest tightened, and I felt ice in my stomach. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to hear. I sat frozen, staring into the dark, the whistle carrying on for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. Silence swallowed everything. I didn't move, didn't even blink. After a while, I forced myself into the tent, zipped it shut, and sat upright with the knife in my hand, listening until exhaustion finally pulled me into sleep. When I woke the next morning, there were footprints in the dirt near the fire. Not mine. Bare feet, long strides, circling the camp once before disappearing back into the woods. My skin crawled as I stared at them. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I tore down camp in record time, throwing everything into the truck bed without care. My hands shook as I shoved gear around, my eyes constantly flicking to the tree line. The whole drive out on that rutted road, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. By the time I hit pavement, my shoulders ached from the tension. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, surrounded by gas stations and people and the noise of regular life. Only then did I finally breathe. I never went back to that place. Even now, years later, I can still hear that whistle in my head sometimes when I'm alone. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe just some drifter messing with me. Maybe something worse. All I know is I was lucky I left when I did. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here to tell the story. I was 29 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep in the woods of northern Minnesota in the fall of 2015. I had done plenty of camping and hunting before, but this trip felt different because I was completely alone, miles away from anyone else. I parked my truck at a trailhead that barely had space for 2 vehicles, hiked about 5 miles in, and set up camp near a small clearing not too far from a creek. The leaves were already changing, the air sharp with that mix of pine and damp earth, and the daylight was slipping earlier each evening. I carried a rifle, a knife, and all the usual camping gear: tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, and enough food for a few days. I had this idea that I'd hunt deer, maybe cook some meat over the fire, and just enjoy the quiet. The first night was uneventful, just the sounds of crickets and the creek running low behind my tent. I remember laying there, thinking how good it felt to be away from everything. No phones, no traffic, no people. The second day, I hunted through the morning, tracking deer signs, spotting prints pressed into the soft soil. I didn't get anything, but I still felt satisfied just walking. The air smelled cold, like winter was already pushing its way down. By afternoon, I had covered a lot of ground, and I knew I was deeper than most people would ever bother going. My boots were caked in mud, and my legs were sore, so I turned back toward camp. That's when I started feeling something odd, like I wasn't really alone. It's not that I heard anything at first. It was more the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. The woods seemed too still. The normal sounds, birds, rustling, distant woodpeckers, felt muted. I kept telling myself it was just because I was tired, but I couldn't shake the unease. I remember stopping, standing completely still, trying to hear if something was moving behind me. For a second, I thought I picked up the faint crunch of a footstep, but when I turned, there was nothing, just trees and brush. Back at camp, I made a fire, boiled some water for coffee, and tried to relax. The feeling hung with me, though. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I felt like something was standing just past my sight. Dusk came quickly, the woods falling dark in a slow bleed of gray. I ate a quick meal of beans and bread, stoked the fire higher, and sat there staring into it, listening. My ears kept catching small noises. A snap here, a faint shuffle there. The woods always make noise, I reminded myself, but this sounded deliberate. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low. The thin nylon walls felt like paper with the night pressing against them. I laid on my back, eyes open, straining to hear. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, circling. They weren't animal steps. I've heard deer, moose, even bears moving through woods, and this was different. These were careful, paced steps. Human. I felt a cold weight drop into my chest. I stayed completely still, breathing shallow, praying it was my imagination. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding so hard it seemed loud enough to give me away. After what felt like forever, I heard them move again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent with my rifle ready. The fire had burned out, and the clearing was quiet. I walked the edge of the camp, scanning the dirt for prints. Sure enough, I found them, boot tracks. They weren't mine. The tread was different, flatter, more worn. Someone had been out there, circling my camp in the dark. That discovery shook me worse than the footsteps. I was miles from any road, far deeper than most hunters would bother going. Whoever it was had to have chosen to be here. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but pride got in the way. I didn't want to feel like I was running. I told myself maybe it was just some other hunter passing through. But deep down, I knew people don't wander around another man's camp at midnight. I spent that day hunting, but I couldn't focus. Every snapped twig made me spin around. I didn't see any deer, didn't even really care to. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already low. I set the fire big and kept my rifle close. The woods were darker that night, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Again, the noises started, not constant, but enough. Twigs breaking, faint shifting. Then, after hours of silence, I smelled smoke. Not mine. It drifted faintly through the trees, mixed with the damp smell of leaves. Someone else had a fire nearby. I stood there, frozen, trying to pinpoint the direction. Couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards away. That confirmed it. Whoever had walked through camp was still out there. I barely slept again, listening, waiting. Just before dawn, I heard it. A single whistle. Not like a bird, but short, sharp, human. Came from the tree-line. Then nothing. No more footsteps. No voice. Just silence swallowing it up. By the third morning, I'd had enough. My nerves were frayed raw, and my gut told me if I stayed, something bad would happen. I packed fast, stomping out the fire, throwing gear into my pack without care. As I moved through the woods back toward the trail, I kept glancing behind me. A couple times I swore I saw movement, just a shape slipping between trees, but when I stopped, nothing followed. When I finally reached my truck, it was mid-afternoon. The relief I felt seeing it sitting there was almost overwhelming. But that relief died when I noticed something. The passenger door was open. I knew damn well I had locked it when I left. I approached slow, rifle raised. Inside, the glove box had been emptied onto the seat. Maps, paperwork, my small first aid kit all tossed around. Nothing major was stolen, but someone had been inside, going through my things. I scanned the dirt around the truck, and sure enough, there were more boot prints. Same tread I'd seen at camp. That was the moment the fear finally settled into something solid. Whoever it was, they had followed me. They weren't just some random hunter passing through. They had walked circles around my camp at night, built their own fire nearby, whistled into the darkness, and gone through my truck. I didn't wait around to see if they'd show themselves. I started the engine and drove, watching the tree line in the mirror until the forest was gone. By the time I hit the highway, the tension in my body had left me shaking. I didn't stop until I was nearly 2 hours away, pulled into a gas station, and just sat there with my head on the steering wheel. I kept thinking about those footprints, the careful steps around my tent, the whistle in the dark. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still hunt, still head into the woods, but never without someone I trust beside me. The wilderness has its dangers, but nothing unsettles me more than the thought of another person out there, hidden, watching, waiting. Because out there, miles from help, you realize how easy it would be for someone to decide you don't make it back. I never liked writing about what happened that summer, but sometimes it plays in my head so clear I feel like I'm still there. It was the summer of 2013. I was 23 years old, broke, and restless. I had a used tent, a small backpack, and more free time than I probably should have had. I decided to go camping out in the desert scrublands of northern New Mexico, not too far from the Colorado line. I'd been out there before, usually with friends, but this time I wanted to be alone for a few days. I thought it would clear my head. The land was dry, wide open, and quiet in a way that makes you feel like you're the last person on Earth. During the day, the sun burned hard, but at night, the air dropped cold, and the wind moved through the brush like whispers. I set my tent near a dry creek bed, about half a mile from where my old pickup was parked along a dirt track. No one knew exactly where I had gone, just the rough direction, but that didn't bother me. I liked being away from everyone. The first day was uneventful. I hiked around, cooked beans on a small stove, and read until the light faded. As the sun went down, the desert changed. The heat bled away fast, and shadows stretched long over the rocks and sage. Coyotes yipped in the distance, sharp and high-pitched, the kind of sound that carries far. It was normal out here, so I didn't think much of it. The second night is when things shifted. I was sitting outside my tent on a folding chair, wrapped in my jacket, staring at the stars. The desert sky is huge at night. No light pollution, no clouds, just endless stars. I could hear the coyotes again, closer this time, their cries weaving together like they were circling something. But underneath the yips, I caught something else, one sound that didn't match. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't even close. It was a long, drawn-out cry, broken in the middle, almost like someone trying to mimic a coyote but not knowing how. It raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I sat still, telling myself it was just an animal I didn't recognize. The desert has plenty of them. But then, not even a minute later, I heard movement in the brush behind me. It wasn't the scurry of a rabbit or the quick dart of a fox. It was steady, heavy, and deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just caught sage bushes, pale and still. No eyes, no movement, but I knew something was there. I could feel it watching. I told myself to calm down, went back into my tent, and zipped it tight. But lying there, listening, I couldn't relax. Every shuffle outside seemed louder. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I barely slept, and when I did, it was shallow and restless. The third day, I thought about packing up, but pride got the better of me. I didn't want to admit I'd spooked myself into leaving early. So I stayed, hiked a bit farther out, collected dry wood, and tried to keep busy. The sun baked everything, but I liked having the heat on my back after that cold night. By the time it sank low again, I convinced myself the noises were nothing unusual. That night, I made a fire. The flames gave me comfort. I ate a can of chili, washed it down with warm water, and tried to settle in. Around midnight, I heard the cry again. That same broken, drawn-out wail. This time, it was closer. Too close. My fire had burned low, and the shadows pressed in. I gripped the flashlight tight, scanning the darkness. Then I saw it. For a second, my brain didn't even know what it was looking at. A figure stood beyond the ring of firelight, just far enough that I couldn't make out details. First, I thought it was a man. Tall, thin, standing unnaturally still. My light hit it, and its head jerked back, like it didn't like the brightness. That's when I realized something was wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging low past its waist, and the way it moved didn't look right. It turned and stepped away into the dark, each stride too smooth, too quiet for something its size. My mouth went dry. I didn't chase after it. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I just sat frozen, listening to the silence where it had been. The coyotes had gone quiet too. That silence was worse than the noises. I forced myself into the tent, grabbed my knife, and sat there with the light on until my batteries ran low. Every snap of a twig outside made my chest tighten. At one point, I heard it again, those same heavy steps, circling the tent slow. I didn't dare look out. I just waited, heart hammering, until eventually the steps faded. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the sun was already burning hot, and I was still gripping the knife. That morning, I'd had enough. I started packing fast, shoving gear into my bag without caring how it fit. When I stepped out to take down the tent, I saw tracks in the dust. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't animal prints either. They were long, misshapen, like a barefoot print stretched too far, toes pressed deep into the ground. They circled the tent twice, then vanished into the brush. I didn't waste another second. I hauled everything onto my back and started walking fast toward where my truck was parked. The air was still, no wind, no sound, just my boots crunching over gravel. My neck ached from looking over my shoulder every few steps. I could swear I saw movement in the distance. Something keeping pace, ducking low behind brush, then gone when I blinked. By the time I reached my truck, sweat was pouring off me. I threw my pack in the bed, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine so fast the starter whined. I floored it down the dirt road, dust billowing up behind me, not looking back until I hit pavement miles away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in a small town. I sat in the lot for almost half an hour, hands still shaking on the wheel, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the firelight. Maybe those tracks were warped by the ground. But the way that thing stood, the way it moved, I know what I saw. It wasn't a man and it wasn't an animal. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I barely camp alone anymore. When I do, it's only in places where I can see other people nearby, where I can hear normal sounds at night. I can still picture that figure at the edge of the firelight. Its long arms, its stillness, its strange cry trying to sound like something it wasn't. And I know, deep down, if I hadn't left when I did, If I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't have walked out of that desert at all. I had been planning that trip for a while. It was the summer of 2016. I was 26 at the time, and I wanted to get away from the city for a few days. Work had been draining me, and I thought a solo camping trip would clear my head. I picked a spot about 2 hours outside of Asheville, North Carolina, not too far from the Blue Ridge Parkway, but still far enough off the beaten path that I wouldn't be bumping into hikers every hour. I packed up my tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with some food, a small camping stove, and the usual gear. By the time I drove out there, parked my car on the side of a gravel road, and hiked a mile into the woods, it was already late afternoon. The place was beautiful. Tall trees stretched up in every direction, and the smell of pine mixed with damp earth hung in the air. The ground was soft with old needles, and there was a small clearing that looked just right for a tent. I set it up slowly, making sure the stakes were tight. I always double-check my tent, because I don't like waking up with it collapsed on me. The first evening was calm. I cooked some noodles, sat in a folding chair I brought, and listened to the woods. You notice the small things when you're out there alone. The way branches creak when the wind picks up, the sharp clicking of insects, the occasional snap that makes you turn your head quick. By the time it got dark, I was tired from hauling everything in, so I turned in early. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that didn't fit in with the usual background noise. It wasn't an animal moving around, at least not in the way I'd normally recognize. It sounded like a slow crunch of leaves, then silence, then another crunch, like something was pacing or stepping carefully. I laid there in my sleeping bag, not moving, just listening. My first thought was maybe a deer, but deer don't usually pause so much between steps, at least not that close. The sound wasn't right. I sat up quietly, careful not to make too much noise with the nylon of the tent. My heart was going fast, the way it does when your brain tells you something's off but you can't explain why. I reached for the flashlight next to me, switched it on, and aimed it through the thin fabric of the tent. The beam lit up faint outlines of trees, but nothing else. The noise had stopped the moment I turned the light on. I stayed like that for probably 20 minutes, breathing shallow, waiting. Nothing came closer. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon or something small moving around. I shut off the flashlight and laid back down. It took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, the air felt damp and heavy, and I noticed something that bothered me more than the noise had. About 15 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt, there were footprints. They weren't boot tracks. They looked like old worn-down sneakers, but the tread was faint and uneven. They circled halfway around my tent and then led back into the trees. I crouched there for a while, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't for me. I had been wearing hiking boots. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was from someone else who had come through earlier in the week, maybe a hiker. But the dirt was soft from rain 2 nights ago, and these tracks looked fresh, pressed deep. I kept busy the rest of the day to distract myself. I walked down to a nearby creek, filled my water filter, cooked some oatmeal, and did a short hike up a ridge. The view from the top calmed me down a little. You could see the blue layers of the mountains stacked on the horizon. I tried to remind myself that people passed through these woods all the time. When evening came, though, I couldn't shake the unease. I built a small fire and kept it going a little later than usual, just for the comfort of the light. Every so often, I would scan the edge of the clearing with my flashlight, just to reassure myself. Nothing seemed out of place. That night, I heard it again. The same careful crunch of leaves, but closer this time, circling. I froze in my bag, gripping the flashlight, afraid to turn it on. The sound moved slowly around my tent and then stopped directly behind where my head was resting. I felt the hairs on my neck stand straight up. I didn't breathe for what felt like minutes. Then, just like before, silence. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat up, shoes on, bag zipped, knife in my hand. I didn't move until the faint light of dawn came through the fabric of the tent. When I finally stepped out, there were more tracks, clearer this time. They circled all the way around my tent and then cut back toward the trees. My first thought was to pack up and leave right away, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to feel like I was being chased out. I told myself maybe it was some hunter, maybe just some drifter passing through. Still, the thought of someone walking around my tent at night made my stomach tight. I stayed one more night, though I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove I wasn't scared. Maybe I was just stubborn. I cooked, kept the fire higher this time, and tried to focus on normal camp things. As soon as it got dark, the woods felt like they were closing in. Around midnight, I heard it again. But this time, there was no circling. Just one slow, steady approach. Crunch, pause, crunch. Closer. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I snapped on the flashlight and shined it straight out the flap. For a split second, the beam caught something. A man, maybe 30 feet away, standing between two trees. He had a hood pulled up and just stood there facing the light. I froze. Neither of us moved. Then he turned, slow, and walked back into the trees until the light couldn't reach him anymore. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat there until dawn, shaking, knife in my lap, light still on. The second it was bright enough, I tore my tent down, stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could, and hiked back out to the gravel road. My hands were trembling so bad I dropped my stove twice trying to shove it in. When I finally reached my car, the relief was overwhelming. I drove the whole way back to Asheville with every window up and every lock clicked shut, checking my rearview mirror every few minutes. I never reported it. I didn't have a name, a face, anything more than a glimpse of someone who shouldn't have been out there. But I know what I saw. Someone had been circling my tent at night, waiting, maybe just watching. I haven't gone camping alone since. I had always preferred camping deep in the woods or up in the mountains. But that year, in the summer of 2016, I decided to try something different. I was 26 at the time and had been traveling through rural parts of Iowa, taking time away from the noise of city life. A farmer I met at a small diner told me about an old property on the edge of his cousin's land where no one lived anymore. He said the farmhouse was falling apart. The fields were wild with weeds, but if I wanted a quiet night under the stars, it would be the perfect spot. It wasn't meant for tourists, just forgotten land. That was what made it sound so good to me. I drove out late that afternoon. The narrow road leading to the place cut between endless rows of corn, the stalks towering on both sides like walls. There were no houses in sight, no power lines either, and my phone had already dropped service several miles back. The gravel road ended at a rusted gate hanging crooked on one hinge. Beyond it, the land opened wide. I parked the car on the side and carried my gear in. The air smelled thick with dirt and dry grass. Off in the distance, maybe half a mile away, I could see the shell of the old farmhouse. Its roof sagged in the middle, the windows dark and broken, and the porch looked like it would give way under the weight of a single step. I didn't go near it. I stayed closer to a small patch of trees near the edge of the field, figuring it would give me both cover from the wind and some shade for the morning sun. I set up my tent there, just a simple single-person one I had been using for years. The ground was dry and cracked. When I hammered the stakes in, I noticed how quiet everything was. No cars, no dogs barking, not even cicadas. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the corn. By the time I finished setting up and got a small fire going, the sun was already sinking low, throwing long shadows across the field. I cooked a can of beans over the fire, ate slowly, and leaned back against my pack, trying to enjoy the silence. but the silence began to feel heavier the longer I sat in it. Around dusk, I noticed the corn swaying in ways that didn't match the wind. A row maybe 30 feet away shifted, as if something moved between the stalks. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer, maybe even just the wind catching unevenly. Still, I kept glancing back every few minutes. When it got dark, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I left the zipper halfway open to let some air in because it was a warm night, and I lay there listening. At first, it was only the distant hum of crickets starting up. But then, around midnight, I woke to the sound of crunching footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They weren't the quick movements of a raccoon or fox. They were steady, paced, like a person walking across dry dirt. I held my breath, listening harder. The steps moved around my camp, circling, pausing every now and then. My chest tightened, and I stayed perfectly still. The zipper of the tent was only inches from my face, and I kept waiting for a shadow or shape to appear against the thin fabric. The footsteps went on for what felt like an eternity, then drifted away toward the cornfield. I didn't sleep again for the rest of the night. Every little sound kept me wired, and I clenched the small pocket knife I always carried, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get in. When the sky finally lightened, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. The ground was littered with prints. They weren't boots or sneakers, bare feet. The dirt showed the clear shape of toes pressed deep, larger than mine, and they circled my tent twice before heading off into the rows of corn. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was had been out there barefoot in the middle of the night in an abandoned farm field. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything and heading back to my car, but stubbornness made me stay. I told myself it could have been some local who wandered drunk from a nearby house, even though I hadn't seen a single house for miles. Still, I forced myself to go about my day like normal. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and walked the edge of the field, avoiding the farmhouse. The prints disappeared quickly in the dry dirt once the stalks began, and I couldn't tell where they led. The heat of the day was brutal, and I tried to nap in the shade, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. By evening, I was already uneasy again. The sky turned gray with an approaching storm, the kind that builds fast across open land. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the wind picked up hard, flattening the tall grass around my tent. That night, as the storm passed overhead, I heard the footsteps again. Louder this time, less cautious, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard. The wind howled, the rain slapped against the tent, and underneath all of it came the rhythm of feet circling closer. I gripped the knife again, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself to yell out, but my throat locked up. Then, for a long time, there was nothing but rain. I started to think maybe it was only my imagination, but just as I began to drift, I heard a sound that froze me solid, breathing, right outside the tent wall. Deep, slow breaths. Someone was standing there, inches away in the downpour, just breathing steady like they were waiting. I stayed awake until the storm faded and the first hint of light touched the horizon. When I finally opened the tent, no one was there, but the ground outside was muddy from the rain, and the prints were everywhere. Big, bare feet pressed into the wet soil, circling again and again, stopping only at the spot right outside where my head had been. That was enough for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely caring if it was wet, and carried it back to the car. I never looked toward the farmhouse, never looked back at the field. By the time I reached the road, my chest felt lighter, though the hair on my neck wouldn't settle down until I was miles away. I don't know who it was out there, or why they were on that land, barefoot in the mud, circling my tent in the dark. I never reported it, never asked the farmer about it, and I've never camped anywhere near farmland again. Some nights, when it rains, I still think about the sound of those slow breaths outside the thin nylon wall, and the thought that someone was standing there in the dark, watching me, waiting for God knows what. That night taught me something I'll never forget. Silence isn't peace, and some places aren't empty the way they look. I was 23 years old in the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone in the Peak District, not far from Castleton. I'd been through that area a few times before on hikes, but I had never camped there alone. I had a few days off work and thought I'd take a break from my routine, just to spend some time outdoors with no noise, no traffic, and no people. I packed a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, water, a small camping stove, and a torch. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I drove out in the late afternoon, parked near a trailhead that I knew would lead into some quieter areas, then hiked a couple of miles in. The weather was clear but cool. I remember the air smelling damp, like wet grass and soil, and there was that heavy silence you only get once you're away from villages and roads. By the time I found a flat spot tucked beside some low hills and a few scattered trees, the sun was already sinking. The area was quiet enough that all I could hear was the occasional sheep calling in the distance. I set up my tent and laid out my gear. By the time I boiled some water for tea, the sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving a pale purple sky. I didn't mind the dark. I'd camped enough times before that I felt comfortable. I ate, sat for a while listening to the wind move through the grass, then crawled into my sleeping bag. Sometime later that night, I woke up. At first I thought it was because I was cold, but then I realized I had heard something outside. It wasn't a loud noise, just the sound of movement, like footsteps brushing against grass. I lay still, listening. It was hard to judge the distance because everything carries strangely at night, but it sounded close, maybe only a few meters away. I stayed still, holding my breath. My first thought was an animal, a fox maybe, or even a sheep that had wandered close. But after a few seconds, the sound stopped. I told myself not to overthink it and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside the tent, and the grass around was flattened in a way that looked odd. At first I assumed it was from me walking around, but one patch a little further away caught my eye. It looked like someone had been standing there for a while. A neat patch of pressed grass, the kind of thing that wouldn't happen naturally. I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe it was just how the grass grew. I spent the day hiking further up into the hills, enjoying the quiet. The weather was good, the sun bright, and for a while I forgot about the strange sound in the night. I returned to camp in the evening, cooked another simple meal, and settled in as it grew dark. That night I woke again. This time it was unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate. I froze in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining my ears. The steps circled the tent, just once, slow and heavy, grass brushing against fabric. My torch was within reach, but I didn't dare grab it. I just lay there, absolutely still, while the sound continued. Then it stopped. Complete silence. I waited, not moving, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to reach for the torch. My hands shook so badly that when I clicked it on, the beam jittered against the tent walls. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The silence pressed in so hard that even the sound of my own breathing felt too loud. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I felt sick from the lack of rest. When I finally stepped outside, the same flattened patches of grass were there again. Only this time they were closer, right next to the tent, as if someone had stood there watching. That day, I told myself I'd cut the trip short. I packed most of my gear, but by afternoon I decided to stay just one more night before heading back the following morning. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably just a curious hiker or even a farmer passing through. But deep down I felt uneasy. As night fell, I sat awake longer, keeping the torch nearby. The moon was bright, shining over the open hills. Around midnight, I heard it again. The same slow footsteps. This time, I forced myself to unzip the tent quietly and peek outside. That's when I saw him. A man standing about 10 meters away. Tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket and trousers. He wasn't carrying a bag, no camping gear, nothing. Just standing there, facing my tent, not moving. I froze, my whole body tense. The torchlight barely reached him, but enough to make out his shape, his posture. He was just watching. I ducked back inside the tent, heart racing so hard I thought it might burst. I sat there, gripping the torch, not knowing what to do. Minutes passed, maybe longer. When I finally looked again, he was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little sound outside made me jump. By morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up quickly, shoved everything into my rucksack, and started the hike back toward the car. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. A few times I thought I saw someone in the distance, just at the edge of my vision, but every time I stopped and looked properly, there was nothing. The trail felt different now. Less peaceful, more hostile, as though the wide, empty hills weren't empty at all. When I finally reached the car park, my legs felt weak with relief. I threw my gear into the back seat and got in, locking the doors immediately. Just as I was about to start the engine, I looked up. At the far end of the car park, partly hidden in the trees, was the same man, standing still, facing me. No car nearby, no gear, no reason to be there. Just him watching. I didn't hesitate. I started the car, drove out of there as fast as I could, and didn't look back until I was miles away. I never reported it. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just some local wandering around, but the way he moved, the way he watched, it didn't feel random. Felt deliberate. Felt like he was waiting for me to notice him. I haven't camped alone since. It was late October of 2016, and I had decided to go camping alone in the Lake District, in the northern part of England. I was 23 at the time, a bit reckless, and thought I could handle myself well enough outdoors. I had camped before, but always in small groups. This was the first time I was fully on my own. I told myself I wanted peace and quiet, a break from the noise of the city. The forecast had shown rain, but not storms, just the kind of steady cold drizzle that never really lets up. I thought I could handle it. I wanted to prove to myself that I could be comfortable out there in bad weather. The ground was already soft when I found a place to set up. It was a small clearing between tall pine trees, the earth covered with a carpet of needles that had turned slick from the earlier rain. I had parked my car on a narrow dirt lane about a 20-minute walk away. From there, I carried my gear, a small tent, sleeping bag, a roll mat, a backpack with food and water, and a little gas stove. By the time I had everything set up, the sky was already darkening into a heavy gray. The air smelled of wet soil and pine resin. Every little sound carried. The drops of water falling from the trees, the shifting of branches, the soft squish of mud under my boots. When the rain started again, it came in a steady sheet. I retreated inside my tent. The patter of rain against the fabric was calming at first, almost comforting. I boiled a small tin of soup on my stove just outside the entrance, ate quickly, then pulled everything inside and zipped myself in. The sound of rain on nylon can lull you into a strange half-sleep, where your mind wanders but your body feels too restless to truly rest. That's where I was most of the night, just lying there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. As the hours dragged on, the rain seemed to grow heavier, and the air inside the tent was damp and clammy. Every time I shifted, my sleeping bag made a crinkling sound against the mat, louder than it should have been. I started noticing other noises, a crack of branches somewhere beyond the trees, a shuffle in the undergrowth, At first I told myself it was just deer, maybe a fox, but the sounds didn't fade. They came in bursts, quiet for minutes, then suddenly something again. I tried not to think much of it, but the truth was I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I glanced toward the thin mesh window of my tent, all I saw was blackness and the shimmering of rain, but my mind kept filling it with shapes. At one point I thought I saw movement, a darker shadow shifting against the darkness. I blinked hard, telling myself it was just water running down the fabric. The ground outside my tent turned to mud as the rain kept falling. I could hear it squelching under something heavy, not the light step of an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. I held my breath. The noise circled around, then went quiet. I waited for it to start again, but instead there was only the pounding rain. Hours felt like days in that tent. I checked my phone and saw it was nearly 2 in the morning. My battery was already low from using the flashlight earlier, so I switched it off quickly and lay there in the dark. That was when I heard it again, the mud shifting, a slow press of weight into the ground. Then another, closer this time. My heart thudded so hard I was sure whoever or whatever it was could hear it. I didn't move. My breathing felt too loud in my ears. I realized the sound had stopped just outside the thin wall of the tent. No movement, no breathing, just silence broken only by the rain. I could feel the presence of something, someone standing right there. My skin prickled. I gripped the little camping knife I had left beside me, though I knew how useless it would be if anyone actually tried to get in. Minutes passed. The weight of fear was heavier than anything I'd felt before. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound moved away again. Slowly, the steps pressed through the mud, receding into the distance until they blended into the rain. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed curled up, knife in hand, staring at the outline of the tent ceiling, waiting for dawn. When the first gray light started to show through the fabric, I unzipped the flap cautiously. The rain had slowed to a mist, the air cold and wet. My boots sank into the muck as I stepped outside. Everything looked normal at first, but then I saw them, footprints in the mud. Not animal tracks, not random marks. Actual human footprints, bare feet. They circled my tent once, slow and deliberate, before leading off into the trees. The prints were long, wide, and pressed deep as though the person had been standing there for a while, leaning their weight into the ground. My stomach dropped when I crouched to look closer. The mud was smeared, as if the person had stopped directly at the entrance of my tent for some time. The prints led off into the forest in a straight line. No sign of hesitation, no sign of clothing or shoes, just bare feet vanishing into the dripping trees. I packed everything up in record time, barely caring if things were wet or dirty. My hands shook as I shoved the tent into its bag. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the treeline. The silence of the morning felt worse than the night. Not a bird, not a rustle, just the sound of my own boots squishing in the mud. I followed the path back toward where my car was parked, every step feeling too slow. When I finally reached the lane and saw my car sitting where I'd left it, I felt an enormous wave of relief, but it didn't erase what I had just seen. I threw my gear into the back without even trying to pack it properly and climbed inside. My hands were still damp and shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't look back as I drove away, tires spitting mud behind me. I never camped alone again after that. It wasn't the rain or the cold or even the noise of the forest that put me off. It was the simple fact that someone was out there, in the middle of nowhere, walking barefoot in the mud, circling my tent in the dark of the night. They didn't try to break in, didn't say a word, didn't leave anything behind but those prints. That was worse than anything else because it meant they chose to be there, chose to stand silently in the rain watching me sleep, and then walked away like it was nothing. That thought has stayed with me ever since. It's the not knowing what they wanted that makes it so much worse. had been planning the trip for weeks. It was the summer of 2011, and I was 23 years old, restless and tired of spending most of my time in the city. I wanted quiet. I wanted the kind of silence that only the woods could give, the kind where you could hear your own breathing louder than the world around you. I had done plenty of small hikes before, but this time I wanted to stay overnight, alone. My friends thought it was boring to go camping without a group, but I craved the solitude. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, small propane stove, food, and water filter. I drove 2 hours north into rural Michigan, where state forest land stretched for miles with few people ever passing through. By the time I parked my car off a dirt access road, the sun was dipping lower. I carried my pack 1.5 miles into the woods until I found a clearing near a creek. The grass was tall and the ground a little damp, but it was flat enough to set up camp. I laid out my tent, hammered the stakes in, and got the firewood stacked before dark. By the time I lit the fire, the forest had gone quiet in that heavy way it does when night falls. No more birdsong, just the occasional crunch of branches somewhere far off. I cooked a simple meal, beans and rice, and sat by the fire while the light faded. The flames snapped and hissed, and sparks drifted upward into the black sky. The creek babbled nearby, but it wasn't loud enough to cover the rustling sounds from deeper in the trees. I kept telling myself it was deer or raccoons. The longer I sat there, the more my mind started trying to attach shapes to the shadows. Every flicker of firelight made the trees seem to move. I tried to relax, telling myself that I had wanted this exact silence and isolation, and now I had it. When I finally crawled into the tent, the night air was cool and damp. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, set the flashlight next to me, and listened. For a while, it was just the stream and wind brushing through the leaves. But after maybe half an hour, I heard a sound that set every nerve on edge. It was faint at first, like someone stepping on dry twigs. A deliberate crunch, pause, crunch. I froze and listened harder. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer moving cautiously, maybe even a bear. But then it stopped. No more steps, just stillness. I lay there waiting, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, I couldn't tell. Then the sound came again, but closer this time. It wasn't random movement. It was heavy steps, slow, like someone walking carefully through the trees. I held my breath. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I reached for the flashlight, but didn't turn it on. My mind was scrambling for explanations. Could be another camper, though I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the car. But who would hike into the woods at night with no light? The footsteps stopped just outside the range of where my firelight would have reached. I pictured someone standing there watching my tent, waiting. The thought alone made my skin crawl. After what felt like forever, I heard movement again, but this time it was fading, going back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, ears straining for every sound. Eventually the forest grew quiet again, so quiet it was worse than the noise had been. When the first light of morning seeped through the tent, I unzipped it quickly and stepped outside. The fire had burned out into gray ash. The woods looked the same as they had yesterday, calm and ordinary, but I noticed something in the dirt by the edge of the clearing. Prints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet. Large ones, wider than mine. The soil was damp enough to catch the shape clearly. Whoever had been there had circled my camp and then walked back toward the thicker trees. My stomach dropped. No gear, no flashlight, no reason anyone should have been out here barefoot at night. I told myself to pack up and leave, but another part of me wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe kids messing around, though the closest town was miles away. Maybe some hunter who ditched his boots. I tried to rationalize it, but nothing felt right. Still, I forced myself to stick to my plan. I'd come all this way, and I didn't want to turn tail after one bad night. I spent the day hiking a little, filtering creek water, keeping myself busy. But even in daylight, I felt watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I swore I saw movement, but nothing ever came closer. By evening, my nerves were shot. I made a small fire again, but kept it low, not wanting to draw attention. When I crawled back into the tent that night, I tried to calm myself down by reading a paperback I'd brought. The words blurred together because I couldn't focus. Then, just like before, the sound came. The steps were slower, closer this time, circling. I shut off my flashlight and gripped it like a weapon. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped right behind the tent, so close I could hear shallow breathing. I didn't move. For a long time, nothing happened. Then I heard the faintest drag of a hand or something slide along the side of the tent fabric. It moved from one corner to the other, scratching lightly as it went. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the zipper, jumped out with the flashlight on, and swung it around in wide arcs. The beam cut through the trees, the clearing, the creek. Nothing. My fire had burned down again, and the woods stretched out black and empty. But the prints were there, fresh ones in the dirt, circling the tent, clear as day. Whoever was out here wasn't afraid of me. They were playing with me, testing me. That was enough. I packed in a rush, shoving my gear into the pack without care. I doused the embers, slung the bag over my shoulders, and started back toward the car. My legs shook as I walked, scanning every shadow, every sound. Half a mile in, I stopped dead. In the mud along the trail were more prints, barefoot, large, pointing the same direction I was heading. Whoever it was had been walking ahead of me. I don't know if they knew I'd be leaving or if they'd just been moving through the woods all along, but my chest tightened. I forced myself to keep going, gripping my flashlight in one hand and the knife from my pack in the other. It felt like forever before I finally saw the glint of metal through the trees. My car. I jogged the last stretch, unlocked the door, and tossed my pack inside without caring about neatness. As I turned to slam the door shut, the beam of my flashlight swept across the tree line. Just for a second, I caught sight of a figure. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still among the trees. Barefoot, watching me. My throat went dry. I didn't wait to look longer. I started the car, threw it into reverse, and tore down the dirt road, the headlights bouncing wildly with every rut and rock. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never told anyone the full details of that trip. People don't like stories without clean answers, and I had none. All I know is someone was out there, barefoot, circling camps at night, and they weren't lost and they weren't looking for help. They were waiting. Maybe for me, maybe for anyone who was dumb enough to spend the night out there alone. I haven't camped alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I was 29 the first time I went deep into the woods alone for a hunting trip. It was late October, 1998, and the days were already short in northern Montana. The air carried that heavy bite of cold that hinted at winter, the kind that seeped into your clothes even when the sun was still up. I had driven my old pickup out from town until the dirt road turned into nothing more than a narrow trail, then walked the rest of the way into the thick woods with a pack, my rifle, and just enough food for 3 nights. I wanted quiet, the kind of silence that only miles of pine and dead leaves could give. The forest there wasn't friendly. The trees were old, standing so close together they almost strangled out the sky. Fallen logs were coated in moss, and the ground was damp enough that every step sank a little. It smelled of wet soil, pine needles, and something sour beneath it all, like old water that hadn't moved in months. I picked a clearing not too far from a ridge to set up camp, thinking the higher ground would keep me dry if it rained. My tent went up slowly, hands stiff from the cold, and I built a small fire ring with stones I found scattered nearby. By the time the fire was lit, the sun was already slipping behind the ridge, leaving streaks of pink and gray across the sky. I sat by the flames, eating jerky and bread, listening to the forest. It was alive, but in a quiet way. Every so often I heard branches snap somewhere out in the dark. Maybe a deer, maybe something smaller. I told myself not to think about bears, though I knew they were out there. The first night was restless. The cold made it hard to sleep, and every little noise outside pressed into my ears. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside the tent. Not walking, more like shifting around in the leaves. I froze, listening. My rifle was next to me, but I didn't move for fear of making a sound. After a minute, the noise faded, replaced by the groan of trees in the wind. I stayed awake a long time, eyes open to the dark ceiling of the tent. The next morning, frost coated the ground. My breath came out white and heavy as I unzipped the tent. There were tracks near the fire pit, hoof marks, deer by the look of it. They circled close to the camp and wandered back toward the ridge. That eased my nerves a little. I set out after breakfast with my rifle slung over my shoulder, following those same tracks. The woods were quiet in that strange way where sounds seemed to get swallowed up. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and the faint echo of my own breathing. I hiked most of the morning without seeing anything worth shooting. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was always gone before I could lift the rifle. I pressed on further than I planned, through a patch of brush that tore at my clothes, and down into a hollow where the air felt colder, heavier. I didn't like it there. Something about the stillness clung too tight, but I told myself not to be stupid. It was just another part of the woods. By the time I turned back, the light was already starting to thin. The sun dipped behind the trees fast, and I realized I had gone further than I should have. I hurried back, using the ridge as a guide, but the woods looked different in the fading light. I kept expecting to see the glow of my fire through the trees, but it never came. When I finally stumbled into the clearing, the fire was almost dead, just faint orange coals glowing under ash. That night was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the tent, and I swore I heard footsteps moving slow circles around my camp. They weren't quick, darting steps like an animal. They were steady, dragging, and they stopped every so often as if someone were listening. My skin crawled, every nerve on edge. I gripped the rifle tight, lying there in the dark, hardly breathing. The sound faded after what felt like hours, but sleep never really came. The morning brought no comfort. I stepped outside, scanning the clearing. The frost was thicker, and the fire pit was cold. That was normal. What wasn't normal were the footprints. They weren't hooves. They weren't paws. They were boots, larger than mine, pressed deep into the frozen soil. They circled the tent, stopping only a few feet from where I had been sleeping. My stomach turned heavy. Out here, miles from the nearest road, someone else had walked into my camp in the night. I couldn't think of a reason for it that didn't make me uneasy. Hunters usually kept their distance, and nobody stumbled this far by accident. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but something in me told me not to panic. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. I forced myself to believe that, though my hands shook as I built the fire back up. The day dragged. I tried hunting again, but I couldn't focus. Every crack of a branch felt too close. Every shadow looked like it was watching me. By mid-afternoon, I gave up and returned to camp, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my lap. I barely ate. My ears kept straining for footsteps, but nothing came. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat inside the tent, rifle ready, the fire burning low outside. Around midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling. My chest tightened with each crunch of leaves. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew I was awake. The steps came closer, stopping right outside the tent. The fabric shifted slightly, like a hand had brushed against it. My throat was dry, heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the walls of the tent itself. I forced myself to yell out, but no sound came. My body locked, trapped between fight and freeze. After a long moment, the steps moved away, fading into the woods. I stayed sitting up with the rifle until dawn bled gray across the ridge. When I stepped out, there were new prints in the frost. They led away from the tent, deeper into the woods. Big, heavy boots. I followed them only a few feet before I stopped. They didn't wander. They didn't head toward a trail. They circled back in loops, weaving through the trees, always returning near my camp. Whoever it was, they had been out there watching me. That was enough. I packed fast, stuffing everything into my pack without care. The air was cold and sharp, biting my lungs as I broke through the trees, back toward the dirt road where I had left the truck. Every sound behind me made me turn, expecting to see someone stepping out from the pines, but no one came. The woods stayed silent, except for the rush of my own footsteps. When I finally reached the truck, the relief was so strong my knees almost gave out. The keys rattled in my shaking hands as I started the engine. The tires spun in the mud before catching, and I drove until the forest thinned and the sky opened above me. Only then did I breathe. I never went back to those woods. Even now, years later, I remember the weight of those footsteps circling in the dark, the shape of boots pressed into the frozen ground. I tell myself it could have been another hunter, some drifter passing through. But deep down, I know whoever it was didn't stumble onto my camp by chance. They had been watching. They wanted me to know it, and that was enough to keep me out of the woods for good. I still remember that night like it's burned into me. It was late summer of 2014 in a forested area outside Asheville, North Carolina. I was 26 at the time and had decided to go camping alone for a weekend. I didn't live far from the area, maybe an hour drive from my apartment, but I wanted to shut everything out for a few days. No phone service, no city noise, just the sound of the woods around me. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, so I wasn't nervous at all when I parked my car near a narrow trail and hiked in a few miles with my gear. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up my tent, the sky had already been growing darker with thick gray clouds. The forecast had mentioned scattered showers, but I didn't think too much about it. I set up the tent, made a small fire pit, and unpacked my gear. The forest smelled damp and earthy, and there was a kind of heavy stillness that always comes before rain. I remember feeling that strange mix of peace and alertness I often get in the woods. Like my body relaxes, but my senses sharpen. The rain started around sunset. At first it was light, just a sprinkle, tapping against the leaves overhead. I pulled my chair closer to the fire and cooked a small meal. The flames hissed when the drops reached them, and steam curled up into the air. I wasn't worried though. I had brought a tarp, so once the rain started picking up, I stretched it out above the fire pit and tied it between two trees. By the time darkness really fell, the rain had turned steady and heavier, and the fire was just glowing embers. I sat there for a while listening to the rain drumming on the tarp, echoing in the distance, hitting the leaves and ground in 100 tiny rhythms. It was a sound I normally loved, something steady and comforting. But that night, maybe because I was alone or maybe because of how hard the rain fell, it started to feel different. The forest was pitch black, and every sound outside that steady rainfall seemed sharper, like a twig cracking or a branch shifting. The woods don't really go silent even in a storm. Things move, things creak. But each small noise had me turning my head. Eventually, I retreated into my tent. The rain was hammering down so hard that I could barely hear anything else, and that alone was unnerving. My little headlamp gave a soft glow inside the tent, lighting up the nylon walls, and the shadows of raindrops streaked across it in constant motion. I laid in my sleeping bag, trying to read a paperback book, but the sound of the rain was relentless. My thoughts kept drifting. I started wondering if my car was okay parked where it was, if anyone else might have come down the trail, if the storm would last all night. Somewhere deep into the night, when the rain had reached its heaviest, I heard something that cut through it. It wasn't thunder, it wasn't the usual shifting of trees. It was the sound of wet footsteps in the mud, heavy and slow, maybe 20 or 30 feet from where I was. At first I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just water running off somewhere or maybe a deer moving through the brush. But deer don't sound like boots hitting wet ground. I held my breath and listened, straining against the roar of the rain. The steps came again, a few beats apart, moving closer. It was faint, muffled by the storm, but it was there. My skin prickled and my stomach knotted. I turned off my headlamp instantly, plunging the tent into darkness, and just sat frozen. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding, louder than I wanted it to be. The steps stopped not far from the edge of my campsite, right where the light of my earlier fire had been before the rain smothered it out. I waited for more movement, but there was nothing, just the pounding rain. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. I kept trying to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe I had imagined it. But then I caught another sound, softer this time. The distinct rustle of nylon, like someone brushing their hand against the side of my tent. It was so faint, but I knew the sound immediately. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't move a muscle. Whoever it was, they were inches from me, just a thin sheet of fabric between us. I sat like that for what felt like forever. The rain kept drowning everything out, but I could sense someone out there, waiting. My body was tense, but I forced myself to stay absolutely still. Eventually, after several minutes, I heard the squelch of footsteps again, this time moving away, fading into the storm. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed awake the whole night, sitting upright in my bag, clutching the small pocket knife I always carried. Every so often I thought I heard something again, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination running wild in the white noise of the rain. When daylight finally came, the storm had thinned out to a light drizzle. The forest looked drenched and gray, water dripping off every branch and leaf. I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped out, my boots sinking into the soaked ground. My stomach dropped when I saw them, clear boot prints in the mud around my campsite. They weren't mine. They circled my tent, pressed deep into the wet earth, and trailed off back toward the trees. Whoever had been there hadn't just wandered by. They had walked around my camp, stopping close to the tent more than once. I felt sick looking at them. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly checking the tree line, convinced at any moment I'd see someone standing there. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled with the tent poles, but I forced myself to get everything into my pack. The whole time, the woods felt wrong, like eyes were on me. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. The hike back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me glance over my shoulder. The trail was slick with mud, and I kept imagining someone following me just out of sight. By the time I finally reached my car, I was soaked and out of breath. I threw my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands left wet prints on the steering wheel as I gripped it. When I pulled out of that trailhead and drove back toward town, I kept checking my mirrors over and over, half expecting to see another vehicle tailing me. But the road was empty. By the time I reached the main highway, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I never went back to that spot. To this day, I don't know who was out there in the rain that night or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone passing through, maybe something worse. But the footprints around my tent proved I hadn't imagined it. Someone was there, watching me in the storm, close enough to reach out and touch the thin fabric between us. That trip cured me of solo camping for good. I still love the outdoors, but I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Every time I hear rain hammering against my windows at night, I can't help but think back to that night in the forest. The footsteps in the mud, the brush of a hand against my tent, and the knowledge that in the middle of nowhere, in the dark and the rain, I wasn't alone. I was 27 years old the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through the backwoods of northern Montana. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job in Spokane, Washington, and by July I felt like I was running myself into the ground. The plan was to take a week off, drive into Montana, and spend a few nights in the wild where I wouldn't have to deal with the noise of people, traffic, or phones buzzing in my pocket. I had been camping many times before, though never fully alone. I told myself it would be good to push my limits, to test myself. I packed light but carefully. A 4-person tent, even though it was just me, a thick sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a hatchet, a good knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, and enough food to last a few days, dry jerky, trail mix, oatmeal packets, and instant coffee. I also carried a small revolver I kept locked at home. I had only shot it at a range a few times, but it gave me some peace of mind with the thought of bears or mountain lions out there. I loaded it and slipped it into the side pouch of my pack, hoping I wouldn't have to even touch it. The drive took most of a day. The farther I went, the fewer cars I saw. By late afternoon, I turned off the highway and onto a dirt road that stretched for miles without a sign of houses or people. My cell phone had already lost service 2 hours back, so I was on my own. Eventually, I came to a clearing near a river bend that looked perfect. The river wasn't deep, more like a long stretch of dark, cold water cutting through the trees, but it would be useful for washing up. I pitched my tent at the edge of the clearing, just far enough back from the river that I wouldn't have to worry about the ground being damp. I gathered some wood, lit a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The quiet was both comforting and strange. In the city, even at night, you hear something: distant traffic, a dog barking, people arguing somewhere down the block. Out there was nothing but the sound of the river and the wind moving through the trees. I sat by the fire until the stars came out. The sky was the clearest I had ever seen it, so many stars it almost hurt to look at. That first night I slept hard. The exhaustion of driving and setting up camp had knocked me out. I woke around sunrise to the sound of birds and the smell of damp earth. I made coffee on the little stove, ate some jerky, and decided to hike upstream along the river. I didn't see anyone the whole day, just deer moving quietly in the trees and once the sound of something big crashing away through the brush before I even saw it. When I came back to camp that evening, I noticed something small that put a strange feeling in my gut. I had left my folding chair set up by the fire pit, angled toward the river, but now it was turned facing the tent. I told myself the wind might have shifted it, though I knew it would take more than wind to move it like that. I tried to ignore the thought, telling myself I was letting my mind get too worked up, being alone out there. That night, sleep didn't come as easy. I lay in the tent listening to the smallest noises, the crack of branches, the rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. At least that's what it sounded like. Slow, heavy steps moving through the brush near the edge of the clearing. I held my breath and stayed still, listening. My mind ran through possibilities. Elk, maybe, or a bear. But the steps sounded too deliberate, too careful, like someone trying not to make a sound. I finally worked up the nerve to unzip the tent a little and look. I didn't see anything at first, just the dark stretch of trees. But then I caught a flicker of movement, something tall moving between the tree trunks. My chest tightened and I pulled the zipper shut as slowly as I could. I reached for the revolver in my pack, slid it beside me, and sat there in the dark, gripping it with both hands, waiting. The footsteps faded after a while, though I stayed awake until the first gray light touched the sky. The next morning, I walked around the clearing, checking the ground. I found impressions in the dirt near the trees. Prints, not boots exactly, more like worn-down shoes. They weren't mine. That was enough to make my stomach twist. Someone else had been out there, watching. For a long time, I thought about leaving right then, but pride got the better of me. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe a fisherman who came down to the river at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent most of that day uneasy, glancing over my shoulder, checking the tree line. That night was worse. I tried to build a bigger fire, hoping the light would keep animals or people away. Around midnight again, I heard the footsteps, closer this time. My hands shook as I held the revolver. I kept the tent flap closed, barely breathing, listening. I heard something brush against the side of the tent. Just a light drag, like fingertips trailing along the fabric. My throat went dry. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. At first light, I made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as quickly as I could, shoving gear into the pack without caring if it fit neatly. But when I stepped out of the tent, my heart froze. Right there in the soft dirt, only a few feet away, were fresh shoe prints. They circled my tent. Whoever it was had been walking around me while I slept. I didn't even eat breakfast. I hauled everything onto my back, doused the fire, and started down the dirt road as fast as I could manage. Every sound behind me made me whip around. I kept the revolver tucked in my waistband, my hand never far from it. The hike back to where I'd parked the car took hours. The sun was high and hot, sweat running down my back, but I barely noticed. I just kept moving. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost dropped to my knees with relief. But then I noticed something that made my skin crawl even more. On the driver's side door, drawn into the layer of dust, was a long line, like someone had dragged a finger slowly across it. No words, no symbols, just a line. Someone had been there. Someone had found my car. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors as fast as I could. The keys shook in my hands as I started the engine. The dirt road felt endless on the drive back, every bump and shadow making me think I was being followed. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a little safer, but the unease never really left. Even when I got home that night, showered, and sat in my small apartment, I couldn't stop replaying it. The sound of footsteps circling my tent, the prints in the dirt, the finger line across my car. I never went camping alone again after that. And even now, years later, every time I park my car and see the dust on the paint, I feel the urge to wipe it clean, just so I won't have to wonder if someone touched it while I wasn't looking. I don't know what made me think it was a good idea to camp in a graveyard. Maybe it was the fact that it was late summer. The heat in town had been unbearable, and I wanted somewhere quiet, away from all the noise. Or maybe it was just stupidity mixed with a little arrogance, telling myself it was just another patch of land, just another stretch of grass with old stones. Nothing more. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 21 then, restless with too much time on my hands. I lived in a small town in southern Illinois, and the cemetery I chose wasn't even that far from where I grew up. I had passed it plenty of times, an old church cemetery, the church itself long abandoned, windows boarded up and roof caving in. The cemetery sat behind it, fenced with iron bars that had rusted deep red. Most of the graves were from the late 1800s and early 1900s, names carved so faintly into the stone that you had to squint to make them out. I packed light, just a one-person tent, sleeping bag, a flashlight, some granola bars, and a bottle of water. I set out around 6 p.m., just as the sun was lowering but still throwing enough light that I could walk without trouble. The graveyard was about 2 miles from the edge of town, right off a county road that had more cracks and weeds than pavement. By the time I got there, the light was fading into that orange-gold glow that makes everything look softer. I pushed the gate open. It gave a loud creak and stepped inside. It wasn't a big cemetery, maybe an acre at most. A few trees scattered here and there, mostly oak, their branches heavy and low. The ground wasn't perfectly even. There were dips where old graves had sunk over the years, and some headstones leaned at awkward angles like they were too tired to stand straight anymore. I picked a spot near the back, away from the road and hidden behind a cluster of headstones. I laid down my pack, unrolled the tent, and set it up. The ground was hard in spots, and I had to shift rocks and old roots out of the way. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air had cooled quickly. The silence was the first thing that got to me. In the woods, you hear crickets, frogs, owls, maybe the distant call of something moving through the brush. Here it was almost nothing, just the faint rustling of leaves when the wind moved, and once in a while, the faint groan of the iron fence when it swayed against its hinges. I sat outside the tent for a while, eating a granola bar, watching the sky shift from pale blue to dark purple. Stars started punching through, scattered sharp and clear, and the moon rose bright enough to throw shadows across the uneven ground. The headstones stood out in that light, some tall, some small, each one casting a thin shadow that stretched across the grass. By 10 p.m., I crawled inside my tent. I left the flap unzipped, just enough to let air in. I lay there, staring up at the thin fabric above me, hearing nothing but my own breathing. That's when the unease started creeping in. It wasn't fear of ghosts, because I didn't believe in any of that. It was something else, something about being surrounded by reminders of death. The ground beneath me wasn't just dirt. It was layered with people, coffins, bones. I tried to push the thought away, but the more I tried not to think about it, the sharper it came back. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a crunch, soft but clear, like a footstep on dry grass. My body froze. I told myself it could be an animal, raccoon, possum, even a stray dog. I lay perfectly still, listening. Another crunch, then another. This wasn't the scurry of a small animal. These were slow, deliberate steps. I reached quietly for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling against the zipper of my pack. I didn't switch it on. I just held it, gripping it so tight my hand ached. The steps came closer, circling around, careful, like someone was trying not to be heard but failing just enough to give them away. I slid forward, peeking through the small opening of the tent flap. The moon gave enough light that I could see the silhouettes of the headstones, but nothing moved. My eyes strained, darting from shadow to shadow. Then I saw it, a figure, standing near the far side of the cemetery, half hidden by a tree. It wasn't close enough to see details, but I could make out the shape. Tall, thin, with something hanging loosely from its shoulders, maybe a coat. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My throat went dry. I ducked back inside the tent, heart pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. I thought about yelling, but the silence of the night made the idea feel wrong, like my voice would carry too far and break something I didn't want broken. The steps started again. Slow. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. Coming closer. I clutched the flashlight like a weapon, still not turning it on. Every instinct told me to run, but I was zipped up in a tent, and if I made a sound, I'd give myself away completely. So I stayed, frozen, hardly breathing. The steps stopped right outside, inches away. I could hear the faint rustle of clothes shifting, the almost inaudible sound of someone breathing. My skin crawled. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, not moving, not speaking, just standing. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the steps started again. Moving away. Slow at first, then fading, growing lighter until there was nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up inside the tent, flashlight in my grip, eyes fixed on that flap, waiting for it to move. The silence pressed down heavier and heavier, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. When the first light of morning finally seeped into the sky, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cold, damp with dew. I scanned the cemetery carefully, every headstone, every tree. Nothing. But when I walked over to where I had seen the figure standing, the grass was trampled. Clear footprints pressed into the damp soil. Long, narrow, unmistakably human. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, hands shaking, eyes darting to every corner as if something would appear again. I shoved everything into my pack, barely folding anything, and hurried out through the creaking gate. I didn't stop walking until I was back on the county road, the cemetery shrinking behind me, the old church tower barely visible over the trees. I never looked back. I told myself later that it could have been someone passing through, maybe a homeless man, maybe a drunk, maybe just someone curious who saw me go in. But the way he stood there, the way he circled silently in the dark, the way he came right up to my tent and just stopped, there was nothing casual about that. I never went back to that cemetery. I don't even like driving past it anymore. I learned something that night. The dead don't scare me, but the living do. And camping in a graveyard is not just about being surrounded by graves. It's about being exposed, vulnerable, and visible to anyone who might be watching from the dark. That was the first and last time I ever camped in a graveyard. I had gone camping alone plenty of times before, but something about that trip in the fall of 2014 still lingers in my head every time I even think about pitching a tent. I was 27 then, restless, and craving a stretch of time away from people. I'd taken a week off work and decided to drive out into the Ozark National Forest in northern Arkansas. I wasn't chasing excitement. I just wanted quiet, time to clear my head, to hike, and to hunt a little if I could. The drive itself was long and winding, full of two-lane highways that seemed to stretch forever into the trees. By the time I turned down the gravel road that led into the section of forest I had mapped out beforehand, the sun was sliding low, smearing orange across the sky. I had my old green backpack, a tent I'd been using for years, a rifle, and enough food and water for a week. The road was rough and chewed up, and it rattled my truck until I finally reached the point where I had to park. From there, it was just me and my pack. The trail wasn't marked the way popular hiking spots are. It was more of a narrow path where hunters and backpackers had walked before. I hiked for close to an hour, letting the air cool against my skin as the forest swallowed the daylight. The ground was soft with leaves, and every step crunched. A few times I stopped just to listen, the kind of silence you only get deep in the woods, broken here and there by the snap of a twig or a bird calling from somewhere unseen. I picked a spot not too far from a shallow creek. The trees broke just enough to give me a clearing, and the ground was flat enough for my tent. I set it up by instinct, not really thinking, the way you tie your shoes without looking. I built a small fire before dark settled in, cooked some beans from a can, and sat with my back against a log as the woods changed around me. When night really took hold, I felt it, the kind of darkness you never see in towns or cities. My fire was just a small orange glow surrounded by black that seemed endless. I remember staring past the firelight into that black and feeling both calm and uneasy at the same time. It was the kind of quiet where you start to notice every little sound, the pop of the firewood, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, something small scurrying in the undergrowth. The first night passed without anything unusual, but the second day is when things started feeling off. I'd woken up stiff from the cold, boiled some water for coffee, and decided to hike a little further down past the creek. I carried my rifle just in case I spotted something worth hunting. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was stepping into a place where no one else had been for a long while. The trail got faint, the trees grew thicker, and the air was damp like it had rained not too long ago. About an hour into my walk, I came across something odd. At first I thought it was just trash left behind, but it wasn't. It was a torn blue flannel shirt, half buried under leaves, faded but not rotted through. I stood over it, not sure what to make of it. Could have been dropped years ago, sure, but for some reason it bothered me. I left it where it was and kept walking, but I couldn't stop glancing back at it. That night, I kept thinking about the shirt. Lying in my tent, zipped inside my sleeping bag, I felt uneasy. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak, and more than once I thought I heard footsteps just outside the reach of my firelight. I told myself it was just deer moving through the woods, but the sound wasn't quick like an animal. It was slow, spaced out, like someone deliberately placing their feet down. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I jerked awake at the sound of something out there. At one point, maybe around 3 in the morning, I sat up and listened. I swear I heard the faint sound of breathing outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. My pulse hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't move, didn't even unzip the tent to check. I just gripped my knife in my sleeping bag and stared into the dark until the first light of dawn started seeping through. The next day, I almost packed up to leave. Part of me thought I was just spooking myself, letting my imagination run too wild. But something inside me told me to stick it out. I told myself I'd just push further out during the day and maybe hunt a bit, tire myself out so I could sleep better. I set off again with my rifle, moving deeper into the trees, keeping track of landmarks so I wouldn't lose my way. The forest felt different that day, heavier somehow. After maybe 2 hours, I stopped dead in my tracks. Ahead of me, nailed into the trunk of a tree, was a single boot. An old black work boot, worn out and cracked, nailed there with 2 long rusted nails. I don't know why, but it made my stomach twist. It wasn't trash someone had dropped. Someone had taken the time to nail that boot into the tree like a marker or a warning. I turned around and headed back to camp, moving faster than I wanted to admit. When night came, I tried to act normal. Cooked my dinner, stoked the fire, sat there sipping water like nothing was wrong. But my nerves were raw. Every flicker of shadow made me jump. When I finally forced myself into the tent, I left my rifle beside me, safety off, finger never far from the trigger. It was sometime after midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling my campsite. My fire had died down to embers, so the woods were nearly black. I lay there frozen, every sound magnified. The crunch of leaves, a twig snapping, the faint brush of something moving against bark. And then came the worst sound of all. The zipper on my tent moved. Just a fraction. Just enough that I knew something or someone was right there, inches away from me. My heart slammed in my chest. I didn't think. I just grabbed my rifle and shouted as loud as I could while kicking at the tent wall. There was a sharp rustling, heavy footsteps pounding into the trees, moving fast. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as the first gray light broke through the canopy, I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving gear into my backpack without care. My hands shook as I tried to take down the tent. By the time I got back to my truck, I was drenched in sweat even though the air was cold. I drove straight out of the forest without looking back. It's been years since that night, but the details are still sharp. The flannel shirt, the boot nailed to the tree, the sound of the zipper moving in the dark. I've camped again since then, but never alone. I'll never forget that feeling, that there was someone out there, watching, waiting, moving just close enough to let me know I wasn't really alone in those woods. I don't know what their intention was, but I know I was lucky to leave. That trip cured me of ever craving solitude the way I once did. The forest isn't empty, no matter how quiet it seems. I was 24 years old in the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the south of France. I had always been the type to travel alone, not because I disliked company, but because I liked the silence that came with it. I could set up my tent where I wanted, cook when I wanted, and wander off without needing to explain myself. That year, I had been working nonstop at a small logistics firm in Lyon, and by August I was completely drained. I planned a week-long trip through the countryside, moving from one rural spot to another, keeping off the beaten paths that tourists usually flooded. I parked my small hatchback on the side of a narrow road just outside a small village in the Auvergne region. The sun had been heavy that afternoon, and the air smelled of dry grass and pine needles. I grabbed my backpack, my rolled-up tent, and carried everything down a rough trail that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. The ground was uneven, covered in dry leaves and scattered stones, but I liked that. I always felt safer knowing I was out of sight from the main roads. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found a small clearing tucked between tall pine trees. There was a slope nearby that led down toward a trickling stream, and the sound of running water made it feel peaceful. The air cooled down as the sun lowered, and I set up my tent with the familiar rhythm I had built from previous trips. I boiled some pasta on my small camping stove, ate in silence, and listened to the distant hum of insects. Everything felt calm, like I was completely cut off from the world. When night fell, the forest grew darker than I expected. In Lyon, even late at night, there's always light spilling from somewhere. Street lamps, passing cars, apartments with windows glowing. But here, the darkness was thick, the kind that pressed against you. My headlamp lit only the few feet in front of me, and beyond that was nothing but pitch-black trees. The sounds changed too. The birds quieted down, replaced by sharp cracks of branches, distant rustles in the underbrush, and the occasional splash of water down by the stream. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and laid on my thin mattress. I told myself the noises were normal, small animals moving around, maybe deer, maybe a fox. It wasn't unusual, but still, I left my knife within reach, something I always did when camping alone. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. My tent was stuffy, the air heavy with the smell of nylon and my own sweat. But then I heard it, a crunch of dry leaves. Slow, steady, close. I froze and held my breath. My first thought was an animal, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't the quick, erratic movement of something on four legs. It was slower, heavier, like footsteps. I lay still, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling above me. The footsteps grew louder, coming from the direction of the trail. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my throat. Whoever it was didn't use a flashlight. No beam of light cut through the darkness, which made it worse. Whoever it was, they were walking in complete silence except for the crunch of their steps. I considered unzipping the tent just enough to peek out, but something in me told me to stay quiet. I didn't want whoever was out there to know exactly where I was. The footsteps stopped just beyond the trees, maybe 10 or 15 meters from my tent. I strained my ears, every muscle in my body tense, listening for breathing, more movement, anything. But there was only silence. Minutes passed like hours. I could barely breathe. Then, finally, the sound of steps started again, but this time slower, circling around, almost as if the person was trying to move quietly. The hair on my arms stood up. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, gripping my knife, listening to the faint sounds of someone pacing the edges of the clearing. At one point, I swore I heard the sound of fabric rubbing together, like clothing brushing against bark. But by around 4 in the morning, everything went quiet again. My body was stiff, my eyes dry from not blinking. When the sun rose, I crawled out of the tent cautiously. The forest looked different in daylight, harmless, almost welcoming. But the memory of the night still clung to me. I scanned the ground around my campsite, and my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, leading from the trail into the clearing. The prints were clear, human, and they circled my tent more than once. I packed up in record time. I shoved my gear back into my bag, didn't bother with breakfast, and hiked straight back to the road where my car was parked. But when I got there, my unease deepened. Someone had touched the car. There were smudges on the dusty windows, long streaks across the glass, as if someone had run their hand slowly over it. I got inside, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. My throat was dry as I drove back toward the village. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? That someone had walked around my tent at night? That there were fingerprints on my car? There was no proof of anything more than trespassing, and I doubted the local gendarmes would do much. Still, I couldn't shake it off. Instead of stopping in the village for food like I had planned, I drove straight through, putting as much distance between myself and that forest as I could. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking along the road, but it stayed empty. By afternoon, I reached another camping area. This one an official site near a lake where families were setting up caravans and kids were splashing in the water. I parked among them and stayed there for the rest of the trip. I told myself it was better to camp around people than out in the wild alone. The whole week, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints circling my tent. Whoever it was had come into the forest in the middle of the night without a light, walked silently to where I was, and then just circled me. They hadn't tried to break into the tent, hadn't made a sound, hadn't revealed themselves at all. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. When I got back to Lyon, I cleaned my car and found another set of smudges near the back window. They weren't mine. I hadn't touched that part of the glass since before the trip. That detail made my stomach twist because it meant the person hadn't just passed by. They had taken the time to walk around, look inside, maybe even check the locks. That trip was the last time I ever camped alone in France, or anywhere else. Now, whenever I think about it, I don't imagine who it was. I imagine what they wanted, and I know for certain it wasn't harmless curiosity.